The snow fell thickly, like memories drifting slowly across an old film reel, silent and heavy. Along the deserted timberline road, a silver-white patrol SUV crept forward through the icy mist. Inside, Officer Jessica Thompson gripped the steering wheel with care, her eyes locked on the road that had become a faint white blur. Colorado had entered winter early. Though it was only early November, the Rocky Mountains seemed eager to cast their silence over the world in the form of sudden, unannounced blizzards. In the vehicle's cabin, the heater hummed softly, blending with the steady breath of a 34-year-old woman with resolute eyes. Jessica wasn't easily shaken, but today, something in the stillness outside made her uneasy, as if something out there was waiting to be found. Then she saw it. A low, solitary figure slowly moving in the center of the snowy road. Not a deer, not a bear, and not a human. Jessica gently tapped the brake. The SUV slid a few inches before stopping. She squinted through the swirling snow, and her heart clenched. It was a German shepherd, large. Its dark coat, once perhaps a rich, beautiful flame, was now a tangled mess crusted with ice and dirt. Its 4 paws pressed into the snow, slow, steady, but clearly in pain. The pads were cracked, dried blood frozen into the fur. Its tail hung low, not trembling but too tired to wag. Its posture wasn't that of an abandoned animal, but of a warrior brought to its knees. And the eyes. Amber, deep, dark amber, stared straight at her through the windshield. Not afraid, not pleading. Just a quiet gaze, as if measuring something. Jessica had never seen a look like that. A look that didn't beg for rescue, but seemed to be deciding if she was worthy of being followed. She opened the car door and stepped out. Snow stung her cheeks like tiny needles. The wind rushed through the broken pines, tossing her hair beneath her knit cap. She crouched slightly, her voice low and soft like the early morning breeze. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing out here all alone?" The dog didn't bark, didn't retreat. Instead, it took one step toward her, a limp but solid step, then stopped. Its breath came out like smoke in the cold air. And then it turned away, slowly, deliberately. Jessica held her breath. Her hand hovered near her belt, an instinct from years of training but not out of suspicion, out of awe. She had seen strays. She had seen scared, fleeing animals. But not like this. Not like it was asking her to follow. "Wait," she whispered. As if in response, the dog paused and looked back. At that moment, Jessica wasn't a cop anymore. She wasn't in control. She was being led. And the one leading her was a voiceless soul, but one with a clear purpose. She reached for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Thompson. I'm on Timberline Road. I've approached a German shepherd. No tag, no human in sight. Light injuries, but highly directed behavior. I'm going to follow it. We'll update shortly." Without waiting for a reply, she stepped through the snow, following the silent figure ahead. The dog's broad paws left clear prints on the white canvas. Every few steps, it looked back to make sure she was still behind. No calls, no leash tethered them in that snowy forest. Just an invisible thread. A silent invitation from a creature that had known loss, yet still believed someone in this world might understand. And Jessica didn't follow because she was a cop. She followed because she was human, unknowing that this step would lead her into a story that would not only save a man's life, but awaken a long-lost faith in an entire town. The snow kept falling, each flake drifting slowly, as if contemplating where to land. Jessica moved quietly behind the German shepherd, its paw prints leading her off the familiar path of humanity, and into a part of the forest only the most persistent spirits dared enter. There was no sound but the wind, the crunch of snow beneath her boots, and the faint, smoky breath of a creature pouring its last reserves of strength into something greater than itself. The dog. She still didn't know its name, but in her mind, one surfaced without asking. Shadow. As if the snow itself had whispered it to her. A name that needed no permission, no assignment, only recognition. Shadow. The silent dark. The wordless guide. It didn't rush, but it didn't dawdle either. Just enough for her to keep pace, never enough for her to take control. Each time they passed a wide pine trunk, Shadow would turn to look at her. The gaze wasn't commanding. It was asking, silently, "Are you still with me?" And somehow Jessica found herself nodding, even though no one had asked. After nearly 50 paces, they reached a small clearing, sheltered by a thick pine canopy. In the middle, beneath a blanket of snow and scattered needles, Shadow stopped. It didn't bark. It didn't dig. It merely lowered its head, sniffed lightly, then sat beside a slightly raised mound, an unnatural bump, as if the snow was hiding something beneath. Jessica approached slowly. Her gloved hand brushed the powdery snow away. A cylindrical object emerged, black, ice-cold, and covered in frost. A device, a military-grade rescue beacon, the type used only in training or special operations. The nylon strap was torn, frayed threads jutting out. She turned it over carefully, then froze. A barely legible line, nearly erased by weather, still clung to the surface under the dim light. Property of Logan Pierce. That name hit like a punch to the throat. Jessica stepped back. Logan Pierce. She'd heard that name just 3 days ago. A rescue trainer and K-9 specialist from the Rockies reported missing during a simulated avalanche drill. No trace had been found. His GPS signal had vanished nearby. Search teams had been called off due to the blizzard. Jessica turned to Shadow. The dog was no longer sitting. It lay beside a small, fallen log, head resting on its front paws, eyes never leaving hers, not urging, not pleading, just waiting for her to see the truth. "You were with him," Jessica whispered. "You brought this here." Shadow didn't respond, but its eyes deepened, darkened, as if confirming her words. No collar, no tag, no signs of a lost pet. But the way it had led her, the way it stopped, the exactness of its actions, this wasn't random. This was a trained dog. Not one that followed commands, but one that could read human despair. And now it was speaking, not with a bark, but with presence, that Logan Pierce was still out there. Jessica took a breath, her hands trembling, not from cold, but from the gravity rising from her gut to her throat. She radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Thompson. I've located Logan Pierce's rescue beacon. The position is near Timberline, northeast of Trail 7. The current whereabouts of the subject are unknown, but I believe this dog found me. To bring me to him." A voice crackled through static on the other end. "Confirmed. Coordinates recorded. Proceed with caution. Rescue units en route." Jessica clicked off the radio, then knelt beside Shadow, the quiet one who had crossed ice, hunger, and loneliness just to reach the right person. "You're not lost," she murmured, brushing snow gently from his back. "You're on a mission, aren't you, Shadow?" The dog said nothing, but it stood, slowly, turned toward the north, where the trees stood like the silent columns of an ancient cathedral, and it walked on, again. New prints pressed into the snow, firm, clear. No longer a journey of survival, but an invitation to something greater than fear. Jessica followed. No longer an officer on duty, but a person learning to trust the quietest kind of faith. The faith of a creature that needed no words, yet had the power to save an entire life. Snow blanketed the forest, but not enough to obscure the footprints of a soul on a mission no one had assigned. Jessica followed quietly. She didn't know how far she had wandered from the trail, only that each step she took sank deeper into an untold story. Ahead of her, the German shepherd kept walking at a steady pace. Every step it made seemed deliberate, as if calculated. Not a hint of hesitation. Occasionally, it would turn its head, those amber eyes silently asking, "Are you still with me?" And each time, Jessica nodded. Not with words, but through an instinctive answer. She didn't understand why she trusted this dog so deeply. It wasn't out of pity, though clearly, this animal had likely endured more than many humans she had rescued. Its rear leg limped slightly, clearly injured, But there were no whimpers, no complaints, no signs of wanting to stop. The way it walked, measured but determined, felt like someone who had survived pain and refused to let that pain decide the journey. Soon, they reached a small clearing, ringed by ancient pines. The wind shifted here, no longer harsh but low and hushed, as if the forest, too, was listening. The dog stopped. It didn't lie down. It simply stood, waiting. Jessica looked around. There was nothing remarkable. Then she realized the only remarkable thing was him. She stepped closer. The dog turned its head toward her, ears slightly lowered, not in fear, but in a quiet acceptance. A silent, rare gesture, as if permitting a contact rarely granted. Jessica slowly lowered herself onto a snow-covered stone. She didn't reach out. She just looked. His coat had once been a thick, deep shade, like rain-drenched pine wood. Now it was ragged, matted with snow, dust, and time. On his shoulder, a patch of missing fur exposed cracked skin where old wounds had scabbed over. A map of miles crossed in brutal terrain, guided only by will. She drew in a deep breath. And then, without thinking, she said, "Shadow," not naming him, remembering him, as if the name had always been his, called back from memory, not hers, but his own. The dog lifted his head, didn't bark, didn't growl, but at that moment his eyes changed. The gaze that had been steady and watchful now glimmered, faint like a flame caught in a storm. Not blazing, but enough to say, he heard, and he accepted. Jessica felt her chest tighten. Not from fear, but from knowing that from this moment on, she wasn't the only one searching. She wasn't just looking for Logan Pierce. She had found a creature who knew how to choose, and had chosen her. "Your name is Shadow," she said again, softer now, a confirmation. The dog didn't move, but gently lowered himself to lie beside the stone. His head rested on his front paws, ears alert, eyes open, watchful, like a soldier taking a breath between missions, ready to rise when the time came. She turned on her radio, but her voice now wasn't that of an officer reporting facts. It was the voice of someone sharing something she knew would change everything. "Dispatch, this is Thompson. I'm currently at the northeastern edge of Timberline Forest. Confirmed recovered locator belonging to Logan Pierce. Coordinates to follow. Additionally, I'm accompanied by a German Shepherd, possibly a former K9. No tag, no collar. Minor injuries, but behavior indicates a high training level. Not a stray. I believe he led me to the signal." A brief silence came from the other end. Then the static broke. "Confirmed. A rapid response team will be deployed. Keep tracking. Stay in contact." Jessica lowered the radio. The wind stirred again. She looked down at Shadow. Still by her feet, not asleep, not closing his eyes, just present. She thought about all the lives lost in these woods, the ones who wandered or simply were forgotten. Shadow wasn't human, and maybe that was why. He had never abandoned anyone. Only humans sometimes abandon themselves. She reached out again and placed her hand on his head. This time he didn't pull away. His ears folded slightly, as if to listen better. His coat, though dry and coarse, was strangely warm under her palm. Jessica didn't say anything more. Shadow was here now, and from that moment on, he had a name. Shadow remained still beside the snow-covered rock, like a sentinel guarding a final refuge. Jessica sat next to him, her eyes fixed on the faint movement in the woods ahead. The snow had let up, but the forest remained damp and hushed, as if swallowing every sound. The first noise came from afar, a vehicle crawling slowly over hardened snow, heavy, slow, and familiar. She recognized the reflective lights of the rescue team. A gray van turned onto the narrow trail, stopping about 10 meters away. A door opened. 2 figures stepped out. The first was Tyler Brooks, a longtime rescuer, broad-shouldered, rugged, his thick beard tinged with snow. The second, smaller and more graceful in her stride, June Bennett. Her black hair was tucked under a charcoal beanie. She wore a deep red rescue parka, fleece-lined pants, and pale brown eyes, tired but sharp, that instantly locked onto the shape of Shadow. Jessica rose. Shadow didn't move, just lifted his head, eyes tracking the approaching woman. June stopped after a few steps. She stared at Shadow, as if seeing a familiar ghost in the mist. Her breath quickened, not just from the cold, but from something welling up, quiet and unexpected. She began, but the words faded. Jessica nodded, filling the silence. The locator device confirms it's Logan Pierce's. I believe this dog led me here. June nodded, her eyes still on Shadow. Her hand tightened at her coat's hem. Her lips parted slightly, as though speaking not to the present, but to a memory. The way he lifted his head, it's just like Jasper. Jessica tilted her head. Jasper? June gave a soft smile. A smile without joy. My brother Will's dog. He died in an avalanche 3 years ago. Jasper didn't survive. But the way this one looks walks the way his ears twitch when the wind shifts. I haven't seen that in 3 years. Jessica stood still. She had heard of such reactions, how memory bleeds into the present, especially for those who've suffered sudden loss. But what struck her was that Shadow was looking at June, too. Not as a stranger, but as someone remembered. A long silence passed. Shadow stood up. He walked toward June, each step deliberate, cautious, not hesitant, not eager. Even the way he moved seemed measured, as if he could sense the space between them was a fragile border between now and then. June didn't move. When Shadow stopped right in front of her, just a breath away, Jessica felt a lump rise in her throat. June lowered herself, slowly, very slowly, and reached out her hand. Shadow didn't touch her immediately. Instead, he bowed his head slightly lower, a gesture of humility, not submission. One that said, I understand wounds that cannot be touched. June's hand brushed lightly across his head. She closed her eyes, not to feel his fur, but to hold on to the moment, a moment in which, wordlessly, she reclaimed a piece of what had been lost. Jessica turned away, giving her space. Soon after, the support team began setting up the search point. Tyler activated a secondary beacon, confirming that Logan's last signal came from somewhere nearby, but not precisely where they stood. It seemed he may have tried to move after triggering it. June sat beside Shadow, her hand resting on his back, rising and falling with his breath. She spoke, not like she was explaining, but as if reading aloud from a journal left in an old drawer. After Will died, I left the team. I couldn't go back into the woods, couldn't look at a topographic map. I thought I'd never step into deep snow again. But this morning, when I heard about the signal, I don't know why, but I knew I had to come. And then, when I saw Shadow, it felt like a heartbeat I had forgotten. Jessica didn't reply, but she understood. Not everyone gets the chance to face their grief, and even fewer have the strength not to turn away. And perhaps souls like Shadow show up at just the right time, not to pull us from the abyss, but simply to wait until we're strong enough to step down and walk back up together. As dusk began to stain the forest canopy, light spread like cold watercolor across the trees. Shadow lifted his head, eyes fixed to the north, where the woods grew darker, the snow thicker. Jessica saw his tail twitch slightly, his rear leg shift forward, ready to turn. June followed his gaze, then looked at Jessica. He knows the way. It's not just scent. He remembers. Jessica nodded slowly. Then let's keep going, she said. And once again, Shadow stepped forward, not fast, not slow, but with purpose, as if the mission had been renewed, not by sirens or orders, but by the connection between 3 souls, each carrying their scars, now finding a reason to believe in the road ahead. No one said a word as Shadow continued forward. The way he moved, light, steady, sometimes with a limp, commanded silence, as if the others feared breaking the sacred rhythm of a song only he knew. The snow had grown thicker, though it had mostly stopped falling. The sun was sinking low behind the trees, casting the forest in a strange, muted bronze light, the kind of light that appears when day and night meet without greeting. Shadow paused beside a thick root protruding from the ground, dark, coated with white frost. He lowered his head, sniffed, and then gently scraped at the snow with a forepaw. Not urgently, not forcefully, just enough for Jessica to notice. She stepped forward. Her gloved hand brushed away the remaining snow, revealing a black strap, a harness, part of professional mountaineering gear. The nylon was worn and frayed at the edges as if it had been pulled under great force. Same type Logan used, Tyler noted. Number 8 rope, lightweight but rated for high loads, not something casual hikers carry. Jessica nodded, a sharp ache tightening in her chest. She knelt to inspect it further, turning the layers carefully. At the buckle there was a rough, hand-sewn stitch. Red thread, shaped like a tiny arrow. June dropped beside her, her hand trembling. "I stitched that," she whispered, her voice barely more than wind. "Last year, just to mark his pack during training." No one spoke further. Shadow scraped away another layer of snow and stepped back. Beneath the ice, they uncovered a gray-green backpack, almost completely buried. Jessica and Tyler hauled it out together. It was damp, cold, and stiff from frozen snow. The upper pocket was jammed shut. They had to pry it open with a knife. Inside, folded in quarters, was a piece of paper, blurred by moisture but still legible. On its outside, shaky handwriting scrawled, "Cabin, northeast slope, shelter." A red arrow was drawn beneath the words, pointing slightly to the right. June collapsed onto her knees, eyes locked on the paper like it might vanish if she blinked. "He was looking for shelter," she breathed, "and he left directions for someone else." Jessica looked at Shadow, now sitting quietly by the tree root, head slightly tilted, ears tuned toward them. Those amber eyes didn't carry panic or exhaustion, only the look of someone who knew the first part of a mission had been completed. "You found it first," Jessica murmured, "and you held on to it, until someone stopped long enough to listen." June gasped softly. She stared at Shadow for a long time. Then, as if something broke open inside her, said, "You didn't just follow his scent. You remembered. You remembered to wait." Jessica turned to Tyler. "The last GPS ping was about 500 yards from here. That cabin might be where Logan is headed. We need to verify it fast. Lights going." Tyler nodded and pulled a topographic map from his chest pocket. "Northeast slope, steep terrain, deep snow. But if Logan made it, so can we." June tucked the note into a waterproof pouch, shouldered the backpack, and gently stroked Shadow's back. "Can you take us there?" Shadow rose without prompting. Silently, he turned, again, toward the direction marked by the red arrow, and began to walk, step by steady step. They followed. No words, no questions. The way Shadow moved left no room for doubt. There was no wandering, no scent trailing like a dog hunting a trail. He wasn't searching. He was returning. To a place he had once laid down and once waited. Once held his silence, because no one had come in time. In the growing dusk, his shadow stretched long ahead of him. A thin, limping shape, yet solid. A figure no larger than a man, yet carrying within it an entire story of patience and loyalty. Jessica realized that from the moment Shadow had stepped onto that frozen road and looked through her windshield, he had never been just a stray dog. He was the keeper of the final ember in a journey that should have ended in cold and oblivion. She turned to June and whispered into the trees, "If not for him, every clue would have stayed buried in the snow. No one would have found anything." June nodded, her gaze fixed on the footsteps ahead. Maybe Jasper was like that too, but no one got there in time. The wind rose again, lifting snow dust through the bare trees. The night was coming, but in the silence, warmth didn't come from fire. It came from the steady steps of a quiet guide, and for the first time since the disappearance began, they all shared a single truth. They weren't searching for a missing man anymore. They were following the only one who had never given up hope. Shadow stood still at the forest's edge, the wind curling through his tattered, snow-muddied fur, his ears twitching as if listening for something deeper than the forest's sounds. At his feet, a patch of snow had been cleared to reveal a torn harness strap, a collapsed backpack buried in old snow, and a crumpled paper map whose corners flapped in the wind. Blurred red ink, shaky hand-written letters. Cabin, northeast slope, shelter. 3 words. 1 direction. But to June Bennett, it was something else entirely. A voice from the past, echoing back. She didn't rush like the others. She just stood, watching. The sky above had settled into a dull, leaden gray. No sun, no rain, just a soft light falling over her coat and into her eyes, hollow like they carried all 3 winters. Jessica glanced at June. Something in her rigid posture, the clenched gloves, the deep silence, told her this wasn't just another clue. "You okay?" Jessica asked gently. Not as an officer, just one person to another trying to breathe through something heavy. June didn't answer right away. She walked slowly, her gaze tethered to the strap on the ground. She knelt, not with the readiness of a trained rescuer, but with the trembling of someone about to face a grief long left unsaid. Her fingers shook as she turned over the strap. In the dim light, the stitches showed. A single pale blue thread is out of place on the gray nylon. She swallowed hard, then gave a small laugh. Without joy, just recognition of something no one wants to believe. "I stitched this," she whispered. "That blue thread. I didn't know how, but Will said, as long as it doesn't fall off, it's good enough." Will's name dropped from her lips like melting snow. Soft, quiet, but unbearably heavy. Jessica crouched, her face softening. "Your brother?" June nodded. "Will Bennett. The only rescue trainer I knew who let dogs sleep on the bed and talked to them like they understood every word." She gave a bitter smile, which faded quickly when she looked up. Her eyes met Shadow's. And what she saw wasn't just a dog. It had depth, memory, understanding. She wasn't looking at Shadow anymore. She was seeing a living witness to something she'd tried to bury for 3 years. "Jasper," she whispered, barely breathing. Shadow stepped closer. 1 step. 2. Not fast, not pushing, as if testing whether she was ready. Then he sat in front of her and gently leaned his head against her knee, asking for nothing, needing no pet, just being there. And in that presence, the empty years in June's heart shattered. "It's you, isn't it? Jasper?" For the first time in 3 years, she said his name aloud. The name that haunted her nightmares, that came in flashes during bitter mornings when she woke and forgot what she'd quit, her job, her training, even her dreams, after the recovery team returned with only 3 things: a torn harness, a collar, and a snow-eaten scarf. Shadow didn't confirm. He didn't need to. His eyes said he had waited 3 years to hear his name again. Jessica turned to Tyler. "He's not just a stray." Tyler nodded, eyes never leaving Shadow. "No, he's a part of someone," June whispered. "A part of Will. And of me." The air among the snow-laced trees warmed, not with temperature, but from a heart starting to thaw. She didn't cry, but her eyes glistened. She looked at Shadow as if both apologizing and thanking him. "I'm sorry I left, Jasper," she murmured. "I didn't stay to look for you, I gave up. But you didn't." Shadow stepped forward and gently pressed his head into her palm. And in that moment, time closed a loop. A girl who had lost, a dog who had waited, and between them, an invisible thread tied by loyalty, hurt, and a memory that lived. Jessica stepped back, giving them space. She knew that sometimes, all a person needs is a look, a wordless touch, to know they're not alone in their pain. June said softly, "He's not just Shadow. He's Jasper. But maybe Shadow is the name for his new purpose." Shadow, Jasper, sat beside her, as if in agreement, and the pines whispered in the wind, carrying the breath of faith reborn after the longest winter. Dim evening light filtered through the snow-laden leaves, casting a pale gray cloth over the newly carved trail. Etched in human footprints and paw prints alike, no one spoke as they walked, as though any sound would snap the fragile thread of trust holding them together. Only the crunch of snow underfoot, the soft sigh of wind through brittle branches, and the rhythmic glances of Shadow. Always checking to make sure his humans were still close behind. June walked beside Jessica, her eyes often scanning ahead, toward the dog with the firm back and coat now partially dried, still leading with uncanny certainty. "He's not taking us somewhere he thinks Logan might be, Jess," June whispered. "He's leading us to somewhere he knows." Jessica nodded, but said nothing. She had felt it from the moment Shadow veered off the main path toward a narrow northeastern trail, just as the map had indicated. But more than the map, it was Shadow's unwavering resolve that convinced her. Each time they hesitated at a steep bank or concealed bend, the dog would turn, eyes calm but firm, as if to say, "Trust me, it's time." The daylight continued to fade. Yet no one stopped, not out of haste, but because no one wanted to. The silence between them stretched long and solemn, like an unspoken prayer. Logan is alive. They hadn't said it aloud, but with every step, they believed it more. Eventually, they pushed past a pine bough that dusted snow onto their shoulders, and a small, dark shape emerged at the foot of a hill. A dilapidated cabin with warped wooden walls and a sagging roof, like a forgotten box left behind by the last century. But Shadow didn't pause to assess. He walked straight to the door, scratched it once, lightly, then sat down. No barking, no anxious pacing, just waiting. Jessica moved forward. Her hand rested on the handle, her eyes still locked on Shadow, needing to know this wasn't just a hallucination. "He's inside?" she asked softly, not sure whether she was speaking to herself, to June, or Shadow. Shadow didn't respond. He simply inhaled deeply and stared at the doorframe. Jessica pushed the door open. The scent hit her instantly. Musty wood, melting snow, and something heavier. The faint, stubborn odor of fragile life hanging on. In the corner, beneath a dull, tattered military blanket, lay a curled-up figure. Thin, tangled hair and beard, cracked lips, right leg crudely bandaged with rope and bark. Logan Pierce. Jessica dropped to her knees, fingers searching for his pulse at the neck. It was weak, breathing shallow, but present. Still there. She looked up, eyes brimming, voice hoarse. He's alive. June was already rifling through her medical kit. Tyler called the base for medevac assistance. But while the team moved into rescue mode, Shadow simply stepped into the room, padded over to Logan, and sat beside him. Just as he had before. He lowered his head and rested his muzzle gently on Logan's shoulder. Not a reunion. A vigil continued. June froze mid-reach. A warmth, sharp and aching, rose from her chest like an old song returning from the years she'd shut it out. "He never left him," she whispered, almost afraid the truth would vanish if spoken aloud. Jessica nodded. "No, he stayed." They found in Logan's pocket a secondary map, marked with the planned avalanche training route. One section had been crossed out, the place where Logan had likely been hurt. Next to it, in faint red marker, shaky handwriting read, "If I don't return, trust Shadow." Everyone fell silent. Shadow remained beside Logan, unmoving. His body was thin, his coat matted in patches, but his eyes had not dimmed. He didn't bark, didn't panic. He knew someone had finally come. The roar of a helicopter shattered the silence. Blades whipped wind and snow into the sky. Yet inside the tiny cabin no one rushed. No one wanted to break the spell of the moment. Jessica knelt, placing a gentle hand on Shadow's back. "He's alive because of you." Shadow looked up at her, then returned his gaze to Logan, as if to say, "That was all I ever needed to do." When the rescue team entered, Shadow stepped back, making space, but he never left the room. When Logan was loaded onto the stretcher, Shadow followed, head low, paws steady, not just walking behind a man, but a part of himself, As they made their way back through the forest, light snow began to fall again. But no one felt the cold, not after witnessing something holier than survival, loyalty, for no reason at all. June walked beside Shadow in silence, and just before boarding the ambulance, she crouched, placed her hand on his head, and whispered gently, a small promise. "This time I won't leave you behind." And for the first time since they'd met, Shadow lifted his head and leaned it into her palm. Not in need, but in recognition. He had waited long enough. The helicopter circled above the dense forest canopy, its blades slicing the snow-thin air, scattering dried pine needles like dust from old memories. Under the flashing red lights, Logan Pierce lay on the stretcher, his face ghostly pale, almost transparent. Like the faintest gust of wind could carry his life away forever. Jessica steadied Logan's head as medics secured his leg. A quiet intensity creased her brow. Not panic, not urgency, but the burdened calm of someone who had held others' lives in her hands before. Her eyes never left his face, but in her periphery, she saw a familiar figure standing at the edge of the landing zone, where old footprints were still fresh in the snow. Shadow. The German shepherd stood still. No whines, no bark, no attempt to follow. He just watched, amber gold eyes tracking the movements around the stretcher as if counting Logan's every breath. "We're ready to lift off," a voice came through the radio. Jessica tightened her grip on Logan's hand, then glanced at Shadow. Her eyes held something unspoken, too big for words. In a moment that felt carved from a miracle, Logan's eyes flickered open. Clouded by dehydration, blurred by exhaustion, they still found clarity enough to fix on the hazy silhouette outside. Shadow. He was there, head tilted, tail still, gaze unwavering. And though Logan could not speak, could not move, something swelled in his chest, a wordless, primal understanding. "You didn't leave me. You chose me, all the way." The helicopter door began to close. In that final sliver of space, Logan's eyes met Shadow's. A silent connection between two souls. A promise with no sound. "If I survive, it will be because of you." Then the door shut. The rotors screamed. The aircraft lifted off the earth, carrying a man whose heartbeat still fought for a place in this world. On the ground, Shadow didn't budge. Snow circled his legs. The wind lashed his fur. But he stayed rooted until the last glimpse of the helicopter vanished into the silver-gray sky. Only then did he bow his head, slowly. Not in grief, not in fear, but in solemn farewell. A warrior closing the last page of his mission. Rachel stepped beside him. She said nothing. Her gloved fists clenched to stop from trembling, but when she looked at Shadow, resolute, ears tilted toward the clouds, she couldn't help but whisper, "You haven't changed. Still you, since the day Will died." Shadow looked at her, met her eyes, then lowered his head once more. Slowly, as if to say, "I remember." In the helicopter, Jessica buckled in as medics placed an oxygen mask on Logan. Cabin lights blinked. The monitor beeped slowly, irregularly. Logan didn't open his eyes again on the flight. But even in his unconscious state, something remained. A flicker of life, kept warm by the memory of golden eyes that never left him. It wasn't the gear. It wasn't the map. It was the first thing he saw when he woke in that freezing cabin. Eyes that didn't demand, didn't fear. Eyes that waited. At Silver Hollow's rescue center, night had fallen by the time the helicopter landed. Logan was rushed to the emergency, rehydrated, stabilized, and treated for fractures. Doctors shook their heads in disbelief. No one expected a man missing 3 days in a blizzard, with a broken leg and no water, to still be alive. "A miracle," one said. Jessica gave a faint smile. She didn't believe in miracles, but she believed in something else. Loyalty. A loyalty that needed no commands, no reward, no assignment, only a silent bond, one a dog had chosen and held on to with everything he had. That night, As snow drifted across Silver Hollow, Shadow lay curled on a mat in the corner of the center's small restroom, eyes half closed. Every time a door creaked, he lifted his head, listening for something familiar. He didn't growl, didn't whimper. He just waited, quietly, without needing a reason, waiting for the only thing he ever truly knew: he will come back. The night wind had stilled. The falling snow was now just a sprinkle of soft dust resting gently on the shoulders of the night guard at the back gate of Silver Hollow Animal Rehabilitation Center. Inside, soft white lights spilled across the cool tile floor, casting a quiet reflection on the dark fur of Shadow, the German shepherd who had just returned from a life-or-death journey. He had been gently placed in a private room, no cage, no leash, just a clean mattress, a bowl of water, and a thin blanket scented faintly with eucalyptus. But Shadow did not eat, did not sleep. He simply sat there, ears gently perked, eyes fixed on the closed window, watching the white flakes fall silently beyond the glass, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, a call from somewhere far away, or a silence only those who had known loss could recognize. Dr. Meredith Hale, head veterinarian at the center, entered at the start of her early shift. In her 50s, tall and lean, her gray hair was tied neatly at the back. Her voice was usually a firm blend of command and reason. After 30 years working with trauma-affected animals, she had learned to keep emotions private, separate from her patients, even the ones with eyes that spoke or breaths that whispered like wind sighs. But the first time she stepped into Shadow's room, she paused, not because he barked or growled, because he did nothing. Shadow lifted his head and looked into her eyes, not with fear, not with panic, not with suspicion, just pure presence, as if he hadn't come to be healed, but was quietly deciding if this place was worthy of his trust. Meredith slowly approached, crouching down, her gloved hand extended gently. "I'm not the one you're waiting for," she said softly, "but I won't force you to trust me." Shadow blinked, then lowered his ears slightly, not in submission, but in quiet acceptance. Just enough. During the examination, Meredith didn't use a muzzle. She didn't need to. He didn't resist. The wounds on his joints told the story of long hours, perhaps days, enduring sub-zero temperatures. The makeshift bandage wrapped around his leg, a strip of torn shirt fabric, was Logan's. Every mark on Shadow's body was a silent memory. "You chose to stay," Meredith murmured, as she wiped away the old snow from his paws. No wild dog would have made that choice. He didn't respond. He simply rested his head on his front legs and exhaled deeply, as if, finally, he could allow himself to rest. At least for one night. The next morning, Jessica visited the center. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, still in uniform, but without her name tag. As she walked the long hallway where animals were being cared for, her footsteps instinctively softened, not just out of respect, but as if not to shatter the stillness in the room where a very particular soul was resting. She approached the door, silently watching through the window. Shadow lay just as before, but this time he lifted his head when he saw her. Ears perked slightly. A subtle glance, not eager but enough to let Jessica know. He remembered. Dr. Meredith, jotting down notes, noticed the shift. She looked up, eyes glinting with rare surprise. "He hasn't eaten all night," she said. "But the moment you walked in, he sat up." Jessica gave a small nod but said nothing. Meredith closed her notebook and stepped to the window. "He's not like other dogs I've treated. He doesn't need to be saved. He's not asking for anything. He's watching us, deciding who's worthy." Jessica offered a sad smile. "He used to be a soldier." Meredith nodded slowly. "Not the kind we train. The kind born to serve, with their hearts." That afternoon, Rachel Pierce visited. She stood for a long time in the hallway. She didn't go in, didn't speak, didn't touch, but her eyes never left Shadow. Sleeping, his breathing steady, the rise and fall of his back gentle and calm. She had seen that look before, that posture, that way of lying down. Every morning, before her brother Will walked into the forest with his one-of-a-kind dog. "It's you," Rachel whispered, her voice hoarse, as if 2 years of restrained grief had come crashing back in a single breath. Shadow opened his eyes. Didn't move, just looked at her. A look no one could escape. She cried, soundlessly, and Shadow, as if he understood, gently stretched his neck and bowed his head below the line of the floor. A silent gesture, a condolence, an apology on behalf of the one who never returned. That night, Meredith added to the file: condition, stable, social response, selective but positive with familiar faces, behavior, non-aggressive, non-avoidant, highly observant. Special note: long-term observation is recommended. Standard therapy protocols are not applicable. Personal remark: we're not the ones healing him. Maybe he's healing us. 3 days after surgery, Logan Pierce opened his eyes fully for the first time. The white ceiling lights reflected dimly in his weary pupils, but behind the haze of sedation, the first thing he asked wasn't about his condition. "Is Shadow still here?" Jessica, on night duty, froze. She left her chair and walked to his bedside, sitting down gently, as though stepping into fragile memory. "He's safe, at the rehab center," she said, half an answer, half a reassurance. Logan nodded faintly, closing his eyes for a moment. A single tear escaped and was quickly wiped away. His voice was gravel-dry. "I thought I lost him again?" Jessica said nothing. She knew that sometimes people didn't need comfort, just someone willing to sit in silence beside them. Logan opened his eyes again, staring at the window. Then he spoke, not as a story, but as a memory he needed to remind himself of. "His real name isn't Shadow, it's Orion." Jessica tilted her head slightly, surprised. "Like the constellation?" she asked. Logan gave a dry smile. "Yeah, he used to guide those who couldn't find the light, like stars in the winter sky." Then he went on, each word unearthing something long buried. "Orion wasn't a combat dog, not a police K9. He was a special therapy dog, trained through the Deep Emotional Response program at Fort Laken. The kind of dog who didn't follow verbal commands. He followed emotion. He sensed people, detected pain even when they said nothing. No crying, no yelling, just a heart out of rhythm, and he'd be there." Jessica exhaled. She had seen rescue dogs, trained K9S, but what Logan described felt like another dimension entirely. Logan looked at her, his eyes filled with something profoundly human. Faint hope. "He's helped hundreds," he whispered. "Abused children, PTSD veterans, women who survived violence. Once, an 8-year-old girl who lost her voice after a car crash. She didn't speak for 4 months. At her first session with Orion, she sat frozen. He didn't do anything. Just walked over, laid his head in her lap, and waited an hour. Then she whispered 3 words. "Don't leave me." Jessica's hand tightened into a fist. Her throat clenched. "And then?" she asked softly. Logan stared into the distance. "Then the program lost funding. The team disbanded. Orion was transferred to Will, Rachel's brother, for support in field training. I don't know what happened after. All I know is after the avalanche 3 years ago, he disappeared. I thought he was gone." Jessica stood and moved to the window, looking out at the sky veiled in soft mist. The pieces were falling into place, the way Shadow, now Orion, led them through snow and forest, calm and sure. How he recognized Rachel. How he didn't bark, didn't jump, just waited, like someone who had walked through many nightmares and stayed until the dawn. She turned back, her voice gentle. "Do you want to see him?" Logan closed his eyes and nodded. "If he still allows me." The next morning, Rachel returned to the rehab center. When she opened the door, Shadow was sitting by the window, looking out over the snowy yard bathed in morning light. Meredith stood nearby, just finishing an antibiotic shot. "He's responding well. Eating again. Looks like he's waiting for someone." Rachel sat on the mat. Didn't call him. She didn't need to. Shadow, Orion, turned his head to look at her, then walked over slowly, head tilted as if waiting for a signal. Rachel extended her hand without a word. Orion placed his head in her palm. Everything that had broken in her, the things she thought were buried beneath the snow, returned, whole, quiet, unshakable. When Logan was wheeled to the rehab room doorway, Orion was sleeping, but the faint creak of the door made his ears twitch. He raised his head, golden eyes locking onto the man being pushed inside. No bark, no leap, just a slow walk forward, sitting quietly beside the wheelchair, looking at Logan. Logan looked back, and like a whisper returned from long ago, he said, "Orion." Orion tilted his head, then gently rested his chin on Logan's knee. No more words were needed. Everything that had to be said was already there, in that silent, unwavering gaze. That morning, the lobby of the Silver Hollow Rehabilitation Center was unusually still. The pine tree outside the front door was encased in a sheath of ice, refracting the pale winter sunlight into faint streaks over the snow. Everything seemed to be settling into a quiet rhythm after days of chaos. Then came a different chill, not from the weather, but from the sharp sound of leather shoes striking tile. Colin Rusk, a representative from the Wyoming State Animal Control Board, entered in a dark brown coat. His nameplate read, Senior Compliance Officer. He was lean, ageless in appearance, with cold gray eyes that viewed every creature as paperwork, every wagging tail as data in need of control. He stood in the center of the small meeting room, where Jessica, Rachel, Logan, and Dr. Meredith were gathered. In his hand, a thick folder opened like the start of an interrogation. We received a report concerning an unregistered stray dog, previously removed from the state's therapy animal control system 3 years ago. Based on chip data and archived files, the individual in question has been identified as Orion, Tier 2 certified emotional therapy dog. Colin paused, sweeping his gaze over each person. As Orion is no longer listed in the active training registry and has not undergone reassessment since his disappearance, according to Clause 12.7 of the State Therapy Animal Statute, he must be retrieved and transferred to a behavioral assessment facility, pending official review. The room fell heavy with silence, like snow layering a glass window. Logan clenched the armrests of his wheelchair. Rachel's mouth opened in protest, but it was Jessica, calm, composed, who spoke first. "You're going to collect him like he's some misplaced item?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "After everything he's done, not just for Logan, but for this town, for every person he's helped, you want to put him back in a cage to be evaluated?" Colin didn't flinch. "This isn't about emotions. It's about legal responsibility. A therapy animal, especially one of Orion's caliber, cannot operate freely without current assessments of behavior, health, responsiveness, and psychological stability." Logan spoke, voice low but edged with steel. "He's more stable than any of us." Dr. Meredith stepped forward then. Her voice was low, deliberate, each word placed like a surgical stitch. "I've observed Orion, Shadow, for the past 11 days. He exhibits not only stability but exceptional social responsiveness. No signs of trauma behavior, no aversion to humans, no negative reactions to objects, sounds, or unusual stimuli. The only thing that defines his behavior is this: he chooses who to trust." Colin closed the folder. "I don't deny the animal's capability. However, capability does not equal legal standing. The issue is that he currently belongs to no one. There is no authorized guardian, no one qualified to re-register therapy ownership." Jessica met his eyes squarely. "I'll take responsibility. I'll be his guardian." Rachel stood sharply. "What about me? I'm Will Bennett's legal next of kin, the last person officially entrusted with him." Colin raised an eyebrow. "That's a matter to be resolved in the hearing." Logan, quiet until now, spoke like a breath. "He isn't meant to be owned." All eyes turned toward him. "Orion, Shadow, isn't a tool. He's not a subject, as you call him. He's a being, with memory, with pain, with choice. And if he chose to stay here, to save me, to save Rachel, to guide us all. Then you dare say he hasn't passed your evaluations?" Colin's face remained neutral, but his lips pressed tight. "We don't evaluate feelings. We evaluate risk. Emotion is not part of the behavioral checklist." Meredith placed a sheet of paper in front of him. "Then read this." He glanced down. It was her full report, detailing Orion's emotional responses. The moment he lifted his head at Rachel's voice, the day he stepped toward Logan, every neutral and non-aggressive reaction during medical exams. At the bottom, a handwritten note. "Shadow does not need to be accepted. He chose us, and perhaps the world should learn to respect that choice." Colin folded the report silently. He said nothing more, but as he turned to leave, he offered one final warning. "There will be a hearing in 3 days. Until then, Shadow remains under observation. He may not engage in any therapy activities. Prepare accordingly." The door closed behind him. Silence returned. But in the eyes of those left behind, and in Shadow's quiet gaze from the hallway floor bathed in morning light, there was no fear, only certainty. And the eyes that once waited quietly in the snow were no longer the gaze of someone awaiting a decision. They were the gaze of someone who had already made one. 3 days before the hearing, Silver Hollow felt different. The first snow of December fell gently, layering the town in a quiet white, as if everything was waiting for a new beginning. Shadow, or rather Orion, remained at the rehabilitation center. But now he was permitted to participate in controlled trial interactions, under the watchful eyes of Dr. Meredith Hale and a state-appointed social services monitor. That weekend afternoon, Meredith made a suggestion. If they want proof Orion is still capable of therapy, then let him do what he was born to do. He was taken to a familiar place for locals, but hidden from most of the world. The sensory playground at the Silver Hollow Child Development Center, where children who didn't speak, didn't laugh, and didn't connect with the outside world found emotional refuge. There, everything was felt, not said. Among them was a boy named Jonah Fields, 7 years old, severely affected by sensory integration disorder. He couldn't tolerate physical touch, hated bright lights, despised loud sounds, and was known to react strongly even to images of furry animals. Meredith had initially decided not to bring Orion near Jonah, but Jonah's therapy teacher, Ms. Lauren Grady, had said, "If anyone can touch Jonah without making him scream, that's all the proof Orion needs." That afternoon, the snow had stopped. Soft light filtered through thick windows into a room of padded carpets, building blocks, felt balls, and low-hanging swing chairs. Jonah sat in a corner, head buried in his knees, noise-canceling headphones tightly pressed to his ears. Orion entered the room. He didn't pull on his leash, didn't sniff around. He stopped just past the threshold and sat down. Not because someone told him to, because he felt it. The pressure in the room, the kind of silence that screams. And he understood. The first thing needed here was quiet. Jonah didn't move. His fingers continued scratching at the carpet. Ms. Grady looked to Meredith, who gave the faintest nod. The room held its breath. Orion sat still. 5 minutes, 10. No one spoke. No one moved. Orion didn't try to approach, didn't ask for attention. He just breathed, slow, warm, a ripple of presence that began to melt something thin and fragile around Jonah. And then, for the first time, Jonah lifted his head. His eyes, dull, usually drifting past everything as if nothing truly existed, this time stopped. Right, where Orion sat. No blinking, no fear, just looking. Orion remained still, but his ears slowly lowered. Not in fear, but in deference, a gesture of respect. Jonah slowly removed one side of his headphones. For those who worked with him, it was nothing short of a miracle. The boy crawled forward on his knees, moving just a few steps, slow, cautious, but not pulling away like he always had with animals. When he was within less than an arm's length of Orion, Jonah stopped. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He just sat, face turned fully toward Orion. The entire room held its breath. Orion tilted his head, slowly, then gently lowered himself, pressing flat to the floor, showing his whole body, a complete gesture of trust. Jonah watched. His small eyes trembled, not with tears, not with fear. He edged closer, one hand stretched out, not to Orion's back, not to his head, but to his chest, where a steady, slow heartbeat pulsed beneath the fur. Orion breathed calmly, didn't move a muscle, and Jonah whispered, "Thump." It was the first meaningful word he had spoken in 3 months. Ms. Grady broke into tears. Meredith turned away, wiping her glasses. The social services monitor just stood there, silent, gripping his pen tightly. Jessica stepped beside Logan and whispered, "No one taught him to do that. He chose the right way, the right moment, the right heart." Logan looked at Orion, now letting Jonah rest his head on his front leg. Eyes closed as if the two of them were dozing together in some invisible, safe place no one else could enter. He murmured, "Not to anyone in particular. There's no standardized test that can prove this. Only the touch on the part of us we thought was lost forever." Orion didn't do anything more, but he didn't need to, because for the first time, Jonah wasn't alone. And once again, a quiet miracle happened, thanks to a dog who demanded no rights for himself, and only chose to be exactly where he was most needed. Orion lay still, his strong frame cloaked in thick fur that radiated a quiet warmth, not from body heat, but from a kind of presence that asked for nothing in return. He didn't move. He didn't look. He simply was. A soft, open space where a child could exist without fear of being judged. Jonah sat beside him, his small hand resting on Orion's solid chest. The dog's heartbeat pulsed gently beneath his palm. Not rushed, not forceful, just a slow, steady drumbeat in the distance, reminding him, here, everything moves slowly, and it is safe. Then, in a moment too delicate to be caught on camera, Jonah's little hand reached out, gently touching Orion's ear. It wasn't unconscious. It wasn't random. Jonah lifted his head slightly, eyes turned sideways, quiet as a still lake. And somehow, the boy knew. This was the spot where most dogs react the strongest. But with Orion, he didn't feel afraid. He didn't pull away. The touch lasted just over a second, but the entire room seemed to freeze in that instant. Orion lifted his ear slightly but didn't turn his head. He didn't retreat. Instead, he gently tilted forward, as if to present his ear more clearly, as if to say, "It's okay, son. Go ahead. It's safe." Jonah stroked it, softly, a motion he'd never made with anyone before. Not with his mother, not with any therapist, not even with the softest toy. He let out a breath, a sigh so faint it felt like snow, but it was the first breath that wasn't made of fear. Lauren Grady, the therapy teacher, raised a hand to her mouth. Her eyes shimmered with tears. Jessica stood behind her, barely daring to breathe. And Dr. Meredith Hale, known for her unwavering trust in charts and data, simply whispered, "We just witnessed a breakthrough that no one else could have made, except him." As time passed, Jonah didn't leave Orion's side. The boy lay down, resting his head on the dog's flank, arms loosely around his neck like a pillow. Orion didn't move, just breathed steadily, his calm breath lulling the child to sleep. At that moment, Ms. Grady stepped back and handed the supervising state official the tablet that had been recording the entire scene. The official, there to evaluate Shadow's behavioral compliance, had long stopped taking notes. He just sat quietly, eyes reddening. He asked, "May I get a copy of this? I want to submit it at the hearing." Meredith nodded. "And if possible," he added, his voice low, "I'd like to be the one who signs off on Shadow's emotional therapy certification. No further tests required." Outside, the snow had started falling again. Soft, light, like a nod of agreement from nature itself. Jessica and Rachel stood in the hallway, looking through the glass into the room where Jonah and Orion lay. The scene needed no sound. No explanation. Just a look and belief. Rachel spoke, eyes still fixed inside. He's lost everything before. His former handler, his training program, his team position. But the one thing he never lost was his ability to believe in people. Jessica squeezed her hand gently. Maybe it's because he lost so much that he knows exactly who needs saving. And when. As dusk settled, Jonah's mother arrived to take him home. The boy left Orion's side, no longer with the wary gaze he once carried. But just before exiting, he turned back, ran to the dog, and gave him another hug. This time it was a real hug. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. It cracked wide open in the silence, through eyes flooded with quiet emotion. And in every heart present, they all knew. There was no hearing needed to make it official. No law is required to prove the truth. Shadow, or Orion, was still exactly who he was meant to be. A dog is not built to follow commands, but to listen. Not bred to obey, but to reach into the hearts of others. And this time, he had touched something rare. Trust, pure and new, born in silence, tenderness, and a love that asked for nothing. Spring sunlight filtered through tender leaves, casting warm gold onto the playground. The wall clock inside the rehab center had just struck 10 a.m. when the therapy room door opened, and out stepped a familiar yet different figure. Eli. He looked about 12, much taller than the other children, wearing a gray hoodie pulled low over his head, hands in pockets, walking like someone fighting the whole world. His quiet gray eyes scanned the yard, never holding contact longer than a second. Under the oversized hoodie was a thin frame, braced by an unspoken energy, tense, scared, and angry in ways still unnamed. Jessica stood at a distance with Dr. Meredith, watching. They had read Eli's file. A mother gone too soon, an alcoholic father, then foster care, then boarding school. Violent behavior, defiance, near impossible to manage. But beneath all that cold paperwork was a boy who'd never truly been held, listened to, or trusted. Shadow lay in the corner of the yard, as always, next to Jonah. But when Jessica gave a gentle hand signal, the dog rose. Not rushing, not cautious, Shadow moved toward Eli, as if he had always known him. A certain instinct led him, not toward safety, but toward the hearts unraveling at the seams. Eli reacted instantly. "Don't let it come near me," he snapped, fists clenching. "I don't like dogs." Shadow stopped, 3 paces away. He didn't move closer, didn't bow, just stood there, quiet amber eyes watching. "Shadow's not here to push you," Jessica said gently. "He's just choosing to be near." Eli didn't reply, but he didn't leave either. He turned his back, trying to look indifferent, but Jessica saw the way his shoulders trembled. Not from anger, from fear. Later, while the other kids played, Eli sat on the wooden steps, still close, but not too close. And Shadow, as if understanding the space between them wasn't meant to be crossed by feet, but by time, simply lay down. Quiet. No tail wagging. No coaxing. 10 minutes passed. No words. No movement. Just the breeze and the distant laughter of children. Then Eli spoke, voice raspy and low, as if to himself. "I got bit by a dog when I was 5 or 6. A pit bull. Been hating them ever since." Jessica heard him, but didn't interrupt. Meredith nodded slightly, as if to mark the start of something. Shadow didn't react right away, not until Eli looked over, eyes glinting wet for a moment. Then, the dog slowly lifted his head, taking a small step forward. Just enough so Eli could see those eyes. No judgment, no fear. Just presence. "You can push him away if you want," Meredith said softly. "He won't fight back." Eli stared at Shadow. 1 beat. Then suddenly he kicked. It didn't land. Shadow had stepped back exactly 1 pace, dodging by instinct. But he didn't run, didn't growl, didn't bark. He just stood there, head low, ears down. Not in submission, but as if to say, "I'm not angry." Eli froze. He hadn't expected that. Anyone else, man or dog, should fight back when attacked, right? But Shadow didn't. He doesn't hate you. Jessica stepped closer, voice steady. He knows you don't want to hurt anyone. No one said anything after that. Eli bolted inside. Silence followed, but something had shifted. 3 days later, Eli returned, this time on his own. He sat on the floor, sighed, and looked toward Shadow lying at the far end of the yard. No one called, no one pushed. Eli moved forward, slowly. Shadow didn't stir. He sat beside him, just a hand's breadth apart. His eyes didn't look, but his hand, sometime in the stillness, reached out, trembling. He touched the dog's back, then his ear. Shadow raised his head, eyes bright. Not excited, just a quiet acknowledgement. This boy is opening. Eli bowed his head, hiding his face. Then he started to cry. Not loud sobs, but the raw, broken sound of a child who's never known safety. The first tears to fall after years of being frozen. Shadow tilted his head gently, nuzzling into the boy's shoulder. A small motion, but enough to hold up a soul collapsing. From a distance, Meredith's eyes glistened. Jessica exhaled, not in relief, but in reverence. A dog needing no commands, no words, but knowing how to listen, forgive, and stay exactly when someone is most likely to be abandoned. This boy, Jessica whispered, just touched something the whole world couldn't teach. Trust. And from that day on, Eli no longer kicked when Shadow approached. He no longer turned away. And sometimes people saw him sitting by the dog, quiet, hand stroking his dark fur like wind brushing over hidden scars, bit by bit. That morning, the air at Silver Hollow Therapy Center felt different. Not tense, but hushed. After the deeply emotional session with Eli the day before, everyone seemed to hold space for reflection. Abby, Logan, and Dr. Meredith were all present early, standing near the therapy area, their eyes following every movement of Shadow. Now wearing a soft green therapy vest, like a quiet reminder that this dog was carrying something profoundly human. Today was Mira's first session. She was only 6, with gently tangled brown hair and pale gray eyes that seemed to look into nothing, as if terrified of what lay ahead. Her mother, Elise, was a young woman with a weary face but steady eyes. They had moved from another town after an incident that shook the entire community. Mira had been locked in a basement by her biological father for 3 days during one of his psychological breakdowns. Since then, Mira hadn't spoken. She wouldn't engage. She feared the dark and everything large. They had turned to animal-assisted therapy, not as a miracle, but as the tiniest flicker of hope in a string of hopeless days. And Shadow, so far, had done wonders with many children. So today, every eye watched this fragile moment unfold. The small gate opened. Mira stepped into the therapy yard, still clinging tightly to the hem of her mother's shirt. Dr. Meredith gave a subtle signal, and Shadow, true to his instinct, didn't approach. He stayed several feet away, simply watching. His ears were slightly back, eyes fixed on Mira, body low to the ground, non-threatening. Once again, Shadow chose to wait. Abby and Logan stood behind the fence in silence. They both understood that whatever happened today, whether it went well or not, would mark something significant. Mira didn't move forward. Her small feet stopped on the soft mat near the long bench where other children had once played with Shadow. Her hands trembled in short waves. Dr. Meredith sat beside her and spoke gently. "You don't have to do anything, Mira. He's just there. He won't touch you. Just sitting and watching." Shadow remained still. But as a breeze passed through, the fur on his back lifted slightly. Mira flinched. Then, suddenly, a small whimper escaped, not from her mouth, but deep from her throat. Elise crouched down, placing her hand gently on her daughter's back, trying to stay calm. At that moment, Shadow took a step forward. Just one step, enough to shorten the distance, but not enough to apply pressure. Another breeze swept through, slamming the metal gate shut with a sudden, harsh bang. Mira screamed, The cry tore through the space like glass shattering. Instinctively, she bolted toward the shadows under a nearby tree, collapsed, arms over her head, body shaking. Elise ran to her, wrapping her arms tightly around her daughter. Dr. Meredith quickly moved to Shadow, who was now frozen in place, head low, eyes full of confusion. No one blamed the dog. But the atmosphere shifted instantly. A heavy silence fell and lingered for several long minutes. Later that day, in the small conference room, the team sat around the wooden table. The tea had gone cold. Notepads remained blank. Abby put down her pen and exhaled. Was it a mistake? Did we put too much faith in the impossible? Logan shook his head, but said nothing. His gaze drifted outside, where Shadow lay under the porch, head resting on his front paws, eyes lost in the distance. Dr. Meredith finally spoke, her voice softer than usual. There are no perfect miracles. Some wounds aren't ready to be touched yet. Abby looked up. But what about Shadow? Did he do something wrong? No, Meredith said. He did everything right. He didn't rush in, didn't demand anything. But a trauma like Mira's can't be healed in one meeting. We may need other methods. More time. Logan hesitated. Are we asking too much of Shadow? Expecting him to fill roles no dog is meant to carry? The question hung in the air. No one answered. That night, Rachel was the last to leave the center. Before getting into her car, she paused by the porch, where Shadow still hadn't moved. She sat down beside him. Are you sad? Shadow didn't answer, of course. But when Rachel reached out, he laid his head in her lap. Not just as a gesture of comfort, but with trust, as if to say, I don't know what else to do, but I will stay. The next morning, as Dr. Meredith reviewed the session logs, she noticed something small. In Mira's end-of-day notes, written by her mother, there was one line. She said, I was scared, but the dog didn't chase me. That was all. But it made Dr. Meredith smile softly as she added a note of her own to the file. Not a failure, just not yet. That afternoon, low clouds blanketed Silver Hollow, brushing against the rooftops. Dark pine trees swayed gently in the early spring chill. After the somber group meeting, with everyone else gone, only two women remained standing along the long corridor of the recovery center, Jessica Thompson and Rachel Pierce. The silence between them wasn't filled with suspicion anymore. Now, it was the kind of silence shared only between people who had learned to trust, or were too tired to pretend otherwise. Shadow lay a few steps away, under the warm porch light. Alert but calm, he seemed to absorb the presence of untold stories. Rachel sat on a wooden bench, eyes on the misty gray yard. She didn't look at Jessica as she spoke. Will used to sit here, just like this, on a day when no one said anything. Jessica turned, quietly taking a seat beside her. She didn't interrupt. Rachel gave a bitter smile. Not warm, just deeply human. He was 5 years younger than me, always stubborn but gentle. We were part of a volunteer rescue team in Grand Ridge, where avalanches happened all the time. Will wasn't the best, but he believed in kindness more than anyone I've ever known. She paused. Her eyes clouded, but her voice stayed steady, like brushing an old scar. The day of the accident, I was supposed to be with the team, but I had a fever. Will went in my place. They said he got trapped on a slope when the ice gave out. When they found the team, only 3 had survived. Will wasn't one of them. Jessica lowered her head. I'm so sorry. Me too, Rachel whispered. I'm sorry I never said goodbye, that I sent him on a mission I knew was dangerous. And worse, I can't forgive myself because Bruno died with him. Jessica blinked. Bruno. Rachel nodded. Will's search and rescue dog. A German shepherd, smart, stubborn, always understood Will even when he said nothing. Bruno had been with him for over 3 years. During drills, he always chose to stay beside Will, even when others called his name. Jessica turned to glance at Shadow, who gently tilted his ear, eyes glowing softly in the dark. Rachel whispered, as if confessing, The first time I saw Shadow, I couldn't breathe. The way he moved, the way his ears dropped when someone was hurting, How he never entered a space until it felt ready. It was all Bruno. Jessica's voice was soft, slow. Maybe Shadow learned that from someone who once learned it from Bruno. Rachel didn't reply right away. She looked at her hands, fingers trembling slightly. Then she smiled, not bitterly this time, but with light in it. When Shadow first approached me, he didn't nuzzle like other dogs, didn't wag, didn't try to charm me. He just sat there and watched, exactly like Bruno used to do when Will had a panic attack after a failed rescue. Watching, staying. Jessica swallowed, her throat tight. He's not Bruno, Rachel, but he knows the same thing. When someone is breaking, the most important thing is not to leave. Rachel pulled an old photo from her coat. Will, young, bright-eyed, was laughing, one arm around Bruno's neck. The light in the picture had faded, but the invisible thread between the boy and the dog was clearer than any caption could ever say. "I think," Rachel whispered, "maybe it's not Bruno who came back, but the best part of him living on in someone else." Shadow stood, without being called, without a signal, because he knew this moment needed him. He stepped forward and rested his head on Rachel's knee, eyes gazing into hers like a mirror, not just seeing her but helping her see herself. Rachel cried. No sobs, no sound, just tears, falling onto the hand that cradled Shadow's resting head. No one said anything more, but in that gentle darkness, a part of the past was healed, not by erasing it, but by sharing its space with someone patient enough to stay. The morning after her long talk with Rachel, Jessica returned to the recovery center with a lighter heart. But the peace didn't last. A silver SUV pulled up in front of the gate. Out stepped Cormac Reed, a representative from the Wyoming State Animal Control Department. Long black coat, gleaming name tag, and a thick folder in hand marked URGENT. Jessica, just setting her coffee cup on the table, looked up and immediately recognized the seriousness in his stone-gray eyes. "We've received a report from a recent therapy session," he said without preamble. "At least one account describes unpredictable behavior from the dog known as Orion, currently called Shadow, in the therapy space." Jessica frowned. "You mean with little Mira?" "Not just Mira. There's also an audio report from a therapist noting that Shadow suddenly advanced toward a child following a loud noise." "He didn't attack anyone," Jessica replied firmly. "He stepped forward, then backed off. Mira wasn't hurt and never expressed fear of Shadow." Cormac remained unmoved. "I'm not here to assess feelings. I'm here to enforce the policy. With an incomplete behavioral record and a high potential risk, Orion, Shadow, must be removed from all therapy sessions for a minimum of 10 days, pending further behavioral evaluation." Silence fell, like thin ice cracking. Rachel emerged from the office. "You can't do that. He's part of the recovery process here. Removing him is—" Cormac cut her off. "Not removal. Temporary isolation. Community safety takes precedence over sentiment. No one could stop it." Shadow was moved to the behavioral evaluation wing, a small locked room deep inside the center. No children, no familiar faces, just steel doors and white walls. Meredith objected, but even she couldn't override the directive. As Shadow left the therapy yard, kids like Jonah and Eli turned their faces away. Not from fear, but confusion. Why was someone who had done nothing wrong being treated like a threat? 2 days later, the impact became undeniable. Tessa Quinn, 6½, who had suffered severe trauma after a car accident that took her mother and left her with a head injury, began to regress. Before meeting Shadow, she hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. But after weeks of therapy sessions with him, she had started to whisper her first fragile phrases. "Safe. Stay. Don't leave me." Pieces of language stitched together through the silent presence of a dog who never demanded anything from her. But since Shadow's disappearance from the playground, Tessa disappeared in her own way, too. She sat for hours in the corner of the room. Didn't eat on schedule, didn't respond to her name. When someone approached, she curled inward, as if bracing for something terrible. Jessica knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. But Tessa shook her head. "Shadow's gone," she whispered. One short sentence. Clear, but steeped in a kind of despair that chilled the air. "He doesn't stay anymore." The staff began glancing at one another, carefully, wordlessly, as if they were all thinking the same thing. We are losing more than just a dog. That night, Meredith walked into the isolation room. She found Shadow lying beside the white wall, head resting on the cold tile. His eyes were still bright, but something in their light had dimmed. She sat beside him. No commands, no questions. Just a quiet voice. "Do you know, Shadow, some people lose their power to heal, not because they failed, but because others forgot how to wait." Shadow lifted his head and gently nudged her hand. A small movement, but enough for her to understand. He held no resentment, only the loneliness of someone who had once saved the world, now made to feel like a danger to it. The next morning, Abby entered the therapy room where Tessa still sat in the corner. Jessica followed, carrying a small cloth bundle, Shadow's pale blue bandana from his very first session with Tessa. Jessica knelt in front of her. "I can't bring Shadow here right now, but he sent this for you." Tessa looked up. Her eyes were blurry. She said nothing, but after a few seconds, she reached out and gently clutched the bandana, then whispered one word: "Stay." No one smiled. No one clapped. But Jessica and Abby shared a glance, a silent agreement forming in their hearts. "We have to bring him back. Not because he's a therapy dog, but because there are wounds only he knows how to heal." Saturday morning. Fog curled around the low hills outside Silver Hollow, as if the whole town were holding its breath. Inside the recovery center, Shadow's pale blue bandana remained in Tessa's grip. She said nothing more, but each morning she came early and sat on the stone bench by the yard, waiting, as if believing that if she waited long enough, the door would open and a familiar figure would return. But 3 days had passed. Shadow was still in isolation. Cormac Reed, using his administrative authority, upheld the suspension. His reasoning: insufficient scientific evidence to guarantee behavioral safety. A cold, lifeless phrase. Not a single line in the report mentioned Tessa or Jonah or Eli, children who had spoken for the first time, laughed for the first time, or simply learned to trust a hand, thanks to the quiet presence of one dog. That morning, Jessica stood in front of the town's community board. She wasn't waiting for decisions from above anymore. Her eyes, tired from sleepless nights, were now resolute. She typed 3 sentences on her phone. A dog was isolated because he didn't run away. A child stopped speaking because she could no longer hold him. And a town cannot stay silent any longer. She hit post. The message spread fast. The first to arrive was Lauren Grady, Jonah's therapy teacher. She brought a cardboard folder, inside it a collection of handprints from all the children who had worked with Shadow. At the bottom, in rounded crayon letters, "I want Shadow to come home." Then came Dr. Meredith Hale, with data charts showing psychological recovery rates of children before and after working with Shadow. Not cold admin language, but living proof of hearts that had learned how to beat again. Rachel, as a former rescue worker and Logan's sister, wrote a personal piece titled, "He's not Bruno, but because of him, I learned to forgive." Within 48 hours, a petition began circulating. The headline was simple: "Bring Shadow back." At first, it was just Abby, Logan, and Meredith's signatures. But by day 3, a line of townspeople had formed in the square outside City Hall. The baker, the gas station clerk, a carpenter, and even high school students who had met Shadow through the Calm Emotions program. Each signed their name with a story. An afternoon, Shadow sat next to someone grieving, a quiet lick on a child's hand mid-sob, or just a gaze, clear and steady, that made someone feel they still mattered. By the 4th day, 1,036 out of 1,100 town residents had signed. One thing remained: the media. Jessica, normally averse to publicity, knew it was the only way to make the state listen, by making the entire state see. She contacted an old friend, Becca Nguyen, reporter for the segment Biggest Little Story of the Week. Becca arrived with a camera crew, planning just a quick piece. But after hearing the children talk about Shadow, she teared up. No one should be confined just for choosing to stay. Becca aired the full segment in the Sunday morning broadcast, titled, "A Dog Named Shadow," and the question, "Who are we really protecting?" The clip went viral. By Monday morning, the governor's office of Wyoming called the town. 3 hours later, Cormac Reed stood outside the center, holding a new order. His face no longer cold. He nodded slowly. "We've reevaluated. I was wrong." That afternoon, the isolation door opened. Shadow stepped out, his gait unchanged but his eyes worn with exhaustion. He barely had time to look up before the voices surrounded him. "Shadow! He's back! Look, it's Shadow!" Tessa was the first to reach him. No hesitation. No fear. She threw her arms around his neck. Tears rolled down her face, but her smile lit up, for the first time since Shadow had been taken away. Eli followed, nodding in silence. Then Jonah. Then the others. A circle, uncoerced, unplanned, formed around Shadow, not treating him as a hero, but as something far more sacred, a piece of home. Jessica stepped back, standing beside Rachel and Meredith. She didn't cry, but her eyes were red. "He doesn't know how loved he is," she whispered. Rachel placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "That's okay. We'll remind him. Every day from now on." Shadow looked up at them. In his amber eyes, a quiet light, unspoken but unmistakable, as if saying, "I'm not going anywhere. I've come home, and I'll stay." 2 days after the isolation order was lifted, the atmosphere at Silver Hollow shifted. The wind changed direction. The sky hung heavy, gray, like it was holding back something unspoken. Weather forecasts warned of a snowstorm barreling in from the west, faster than expected. But inside the recovery center, people were still riding the wave of hope after Shadow's homecoming. No one imagined the storm would carry a test greater than any they had faced before. That evening, Jessica walked Shadow to the small cottage behind the center, where he had his own bed by the window. He ate dinner as usual, then lay down, eyes fixed on the windless sky growing darker. No one noticed he didn't fall asleep. He was waiting. By midnight, the wind howled through the cracks. Snow fell hard, blanketing paths within hours. Staff were ordered to stay overnight for safety. The next morning, Jessica was the first to step into Shadow's room. His bed was empty. No scarf, no paw prints, no bark, only a single gray fur on the window rug, and the main door ajar, like someone, or something, had gone out into the night. "Shadow's missing!" Jessica's voice echoed down the long hallway, snapping everyone awake. The entire center erupted. Staff rushed outside despite the storm. Rachel opened the GPS tracker on Shadow's collar, but the signal blinked, then vanished just past the northern woods. Cormac, back for a follow-up inspection after last week's incident, frowned. "Did he run away, or was he taken?" "No," Rachel said, voice trembling. "Shadow doesn't run. If he left, it's because he had a reason." But what reason would drive a dog, just released from suspicion, to leave behind those who loved him, in a snowstorm? That question loomed like a shadow over the entire center. Children like Tessa, Eli, and Jonah asked the same thing. Where did he go? No one had an answer. By 7 p.m., no one had eaten. Logan and Abby led a search crew, mapping out the northern forest, the same path Shadow had once used to guide Logan home. But snow was thick, visibility low, and the GPS dead. For the first time in years, Dr. Meredith wept alone in her office. Jessica, who trusted Shadow more than anyone, sat by the window, gripping Tessa's green scarf like a prayer. In the silence, one fear echoed through every glance. Have we lost him? Forever? On the second night, a strange detail surfaced. A homeless man, found curled up near the old park where children used to play with Shadow, was discovered in a bus stop shelter. He was hypothermic. But alive? When brought to the town clinic, he whispered, "That dog. He laid next to me all night, blocked the wind, didn't bark, didn't leave, kept me alive." The next morning, Jessica visited him. She showed him a picture of Shadow. He nodded immediately. "That's him. Those eyes like he knew I wanted to give up." The entire center fell silent. No one doubted anymore. Shadow had left to save another life, not to run, not to disappear, but because of the deepest instinct no one could teach him, to find the pain and stay with it. Logan whispered, "We haven't lost him. He's doing what he was born to do." Rachel stood still, then let out a tearful laugh. He never stopped being a rescue dog, even when the world stopped calling him one. But the third night came. The storm still hadn't passed, and Shadow hadn't returned. Each passing second was a silent call echoing in the hearts of everyone who had once been healed by his quiet presence. No one dared voice the darkest fear, but they all felt it. If he doesn't come back, what part of us will break with him? Day 3. The sky over Silver Hollow was still overcast, as if time itself had frozen. Snow fell less now, but the cold seemed to cut deeper than any number on a weather report. The recovery center barely functioned. Children didn't play. Therapy sessions were postponed. Even the adults, once anchors of strength, began exchanging uncertain glances. Will he come back this time? Jessica hadn't slept in 2 nights. Shadow's scarf, his signature green, never left her side. She couldn't bring herself to say it aloud, but the thought haunted her in silence. What if this is the last time? On the 4th morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the eastern trees, Rachel stepped out to take out the trash, and froze. A long trail marked the fresh snow. Dog prints, and beside them, small, delicate human footprints, side by side. She held her breath, eyes wide, then called out, voice shaking, "Jessica!" The door burst open. Jessica rushed out, catching only Rachel's whisper. He came back. Everyone poured into the yard, and what they saw felt pulled from a storybook. From the snowy slope at the edge of the center, Shadow emerged. He didn't run, didn't bark. He walked, steadily, purposefully. But this time he wasn't alone. Beside him was a little girl, maybe 7 years old. Tangled blonde hair, a face flushed red from the cold, an oversized coat tied with a frayed rope. She was barefoot, each step cautious, but her eyes never left Shadow, like he was the last thread keeping her from falling. Jessica stepped forward, dropped to her knees, and gently extended a hand. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she leaned into Shadow's side and began to sob. Not from pain, but because someone had finally found her. Police were called immediately. While nurses brought the girl inside to warm up, staff combed through all recent records, yet no missing person had been reported in the last 3 days. No school, no family, no foster agency, no one. It was as if she had stepped out of a forgotten shadow. Later, a social worker identified her, Lila Monroe, who recently moved in with her stepfather near the western forest. No one knew them. It appeared she had been left alone in a cabin. No food, no heat, for 2 days. No one knew how Shadow had found her. No one had called him. No GPS. No search order. Only one thing was certain. He had disappeared into the storm, not to escape, but to find the one who needed him most. That evening, the children gathered around Shadow as if he had never left. Jonah placed a new green scarf around his neck, just like in their first therapy session. Eli sat beside him, gently stroking his ear, whispering something only Shadow heard. And Tessa, as always, simply leaned her cheek against his neck, eyes closed. Safe. Jessica and Rachel stood nearby, watching. "What else could we call this, if not a miracle?" Rachel asked softly. Jessica shook her head, smiling through tears. "No, but the best part is he never needs us to say it. He just needs to know where he's needed." She looked at Shadow, now curled quietly within a circle of children, like a silent sentinel, in a world still full of wounds. And in that moment, she understood. Some heroes don't wear capes, some healers don't need words, and some hearts, even the ones with fur and 4 legs, understand this world in a way no one else can. They stay when everyone else has gone. That morning, a soft fog clung to the mountain ridge behind Silver Hollow, like a velvet curtain, white, thick, and dreamlike. But along the main road leading into the recovery center, everything was ready. Pale green ribbons stretched from the gate to the row of pine trees. Freshly varnished wooden benches still carried the scent of oil, and most striking of all, a hand-carved oak sign stood tall. Shadow Path. A place to stay. A place to heal. Below the sign was a large black and white photo. Shadow lying beside little Tessa, his head resting on her knee, eyes gently closed, her small hand placed softly on his shoulder. No one remembered who took the photo. Perhaps it was simply a natural moment, like all the moments Shadow had ever created. Jessica stepped out from the back building, wearing a light gray coat and a green scarf. Not formal, just warm and simple. She looked at the scene before her and felt something lift off her shoulders. Not a burden, but time itself. Rachel came to stand beside her, holding a pot of white daffodils, the same kind Will used to plant around the rescue team's old shelter. She said nothing. Jessica said nothing. They just stood there, side by side, like quiet gatekeepers to something far greater than themselves. In the distance, Shadow lay on the front step of the new center. No leash, no muzzle, no commands. He was there because he chose to be there. Like always, legs tucked neatly under him, head lifted slightly, ears attentive but relaxed. His amber eyes swept gently over each person, especially the children, now slowly approaching the small ceremony stage. Jonah stepped up first. The boy who once couldn't bear to touch another's hand now stood tall under many watchful eyes. He held a small piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice was steady. "I think grown-ups forget things, and dogs never do. Shadow remembered all of us, even when we forgot ourselves." A soft sob rippled from the crowd. Then came Eli, the once defiant boy. He didn't speak. He just bowed his head and held up a folded piece of paper, a drawing of Shadow lying among a group of children. Above it, scrawled in crooked letters, "Not a dog, a friend." Jessica couldn't hold back her tears. Across the courtyard, Dr. Meredith and Abby stood together. They didn't push forward to speak. They didn't need to. Their very presence, through this entire journey, was a quiet testament to belief, to patience, to a kind of strength that needs no announcement. Cormac Reed was there too. He stood on the edge of the gathering, head bowed slightly. Gone was the hard-lined authority of before. He had come to understand, like so many others, that some instincts transcend policy, and that some souls, even covered in fur and walking on 4 legs, are worthy of profound respect. Then it was Tessa's turn. She wore a yellow dress her mother had saved for her 6th birthday, the day Shadow first made her laugh after 2 silent years. No one urged her forward, but she walked slowly, evenly, with purpose, as if every step carried the weight of the entire town. Shadow lifted his head as she approached. Tessa didn't speak. She knelt down before him and gently placed a white daisy on his thick fur. Then, in a vow that only she could make, she touched his head and closed her eyes. A breath, a moment of stillness. And then, in a voice as soft as the morning breeze but clear as a bell ringing in the valley, she said, "Guardian." No one had prompted her. No one had taught her that word, but it was the only one that truly fit. A name for the one who keeps watch over forgotten children. Jessica wept, for the first time in years. Rachel turned away, gripping the edge of her coat, and Meredith, who once doubted everything, gave the smallest nod and whispered, "A perfect name." The ceremony ended with slow notes from a music teacher's guitar. No ribbon cutting, no long speeches, just glances held in silence, shoulders touched lightly, and breaths of peace after so many days of storms. The children gathered around Shadow, who lay there, as always, head resting on Tessa's legs, eyes closed. His tail moved gently, slowly, like the heartbeat of something eternal. Shadowpath, from that day, was no longer just a therapy center. It became a promise that even when life turns its back, even when memory fades or doubt sets in, there will always be a place, with one dog or many, who will stay quietly until you're ready to arrive. Late afternoon, after the inauguration, the last sunlight lingered on the porch of Shadowpath. The green ribbons swayed gently, and the scent of new wood still floated in the air. The children had all gone home. The yard was quiet, but warmth remained, not just from the sun, but from something permanently changed. Rachel Pierce stood alone by the wooden bench near the window, holding an old folder in her hands. Inside were enrollment papers for Colorado State Veterinary School, the school she once gave up after the death of her brother, Will. She ran her fingers over the paper edges, the texture waking something long buried. Shadow lay a few feet away, head on his front paws, eyes half closed. He didn't need to look, didn't need to listen. He was simply there, as if knowing this was a moment Rachel had to cross alone. She took a deep breath. Every reason she had for stepping back, grief, guilt, feeling not good enough, now felt lighter. She had watched Shadow do what no one asked him to do. Stay where others walked away, carry wounds no one dared touch, and love without demand. She whispered, "If a dog can start again, maybe a person should try too." She signed the form, slowly, steadily, like a promise to herself. In the meeting room behind her, Jessica Thompson sat across from Genevieve Alcott, director of the National Therapy Initiative, who had flown in from Washington to attend the ceremony. On the table was an official offer. Jessica would become the state program coordinator, charged with expanding the Shadowpath model to nearby mountain towns. Jessica looked at the letter, a swirl of emotion in her chest. "I never thought I'd end up in administration," she said with a quiet laugh, eyes drifting to the window where Shadow lay. "Then don't think of it that way," said Alcott. "Think of it as helping hundreds of children meet a dog like Shadow." Jessica tightened her grip on the letter. She didn't need more persuasion. "I'll accept, but on one condition. Name it. Every new center must carry his name, not behavioral clinic, not recovery program. Shadowpath. A place to stay, a place where no one is left behind." Alcott nodded without hesitation. In another room, Logan Pierce, who once nearly died in the snow, sat in a circle of new volunteers, psychology students, young doctors, rescue workers. He still didn't walk perfectly, his left leg supported by a soft brace, but his posture was steady, shaped by the very fragility that once nearly ended him. Logan had been invited to serve as senior advisor to Shadowpath, not because of degrees, but because no one understood the value of being found, better than someone who had once been saved. He told them about the night in the forest, the feeling of giving up, the warm breath against his ear when he thought he wouldn't make it, and the eyes of Shadow, not pleading, not panicked, but quietly saying, "I'll stay until someone comes." A student asked, "Are you sure Shadow knew you were hurting?" Logan smiled, gaze fixed on the sky beyond the window. "He knew before I did." That night, everyone gathered in the backyard. A small fire was lit. A modest meal was shared in celebration of Shadowpath's first official day. Shadow sat in the center of the circle, head resting on Jonah's legs, body leaning toward Tessa, who hadn't left his side all evening. A guitar strummed softly. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. People laughed, shared stories, not of triumphs, but of the times they broke, and someone came, not to fix them, but simply to sit beside them without judgment, and stay. Jessica looked at the scene, the firelight reflected in Shadow's eyes, glowing like memory, and she thought, sometimes healing doesn't begin with medicine, or advice, or therapy. Sometimes it begins with a dog's gaze, one patient enough to wait until you become yourself again. Shadow lifted his head and looked at her. Then, softly, without a sound, he seemed to say, "I'm still here, and I always will be." 2 weeks after the first bonfire night at Shadow Path, as the autumn sunlight began to dim and the days grew shorter, Rachel Pierce carefully retrieved a small wooden box, long kept in the basement of her family's old house. Time had blanketed the lid with dust, but the carved letters remained clear. W.P., the initials of her younger brother, Will Pierce. Rachel sat for a long time on the front steps, the box resting on her lap, her hand gently tracing the edges as if touching something she had never fully dared to face. She had come a long way to reach this moment, not just in distance, but in faith. And now, it was time to fulfill the one thing Will never got the chance to do. That afternoon, Jessica, Logan, and Shadow joined her. Logan's pickup truck rolled northwest along a dirt path leading to Copperhead Ridge, a remote mountaintop, nearly forgotten on local maps. It was a place Will used to mention in his late-night talks with Rachel. A spot no one's heard of, but you can see the whole forest like it's in your palm. Will never make it there. He died before the dream of that summit could become real. The trail up the ridge wasn't easy. Early snow dusted the moss-covered stones. The wind whispered through dry trees. Jessica led the way, focused but softening every time she glanced back at Logan. Still walking with a cane, but steadier now. Rachel walked in the middle, cradling the box close to her chest. And Shadow, as always, followed just behind her. Not leading, not lagging, walking as if he knew this wasn't a journey that required guidance, only companionship. They didn't speak much. The wind and the crunch of steps on damp earth were enough. By the time they reached the top, the late-day sun hung low over the far ridgeline. The wind picked up, but it wasn't cold. From the summit of Copperhead Ridge, the land unfolded like a silent map of memory. Endless pine forests, a lake in the distance, and thin trails that stitched together the places Will once called home. Rachel stood still, breathing deeply. "You made it, Will." She opened the lid. The ashes were wrapped in a soft linen cloth, faintly glowing in the golden light. No one spoke. Jessica placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. Logan removed his hat and bowed his head. Shadow sat down, just to Rachel's left, the perfect place for a companion. The wind stirred, gently at first, then with purpose, lifting the ashes skyward. They rose, then scattered, carried into the valley until they vanished into the open sky, as though Will had finally chosen his direction. There was nothing left in Rachel's hands, but she didn't feel empty. She placed the cloth back in the box, closed the lid, and turned to Shadow, who was gazing at the sky, ears flicking in the breeze. "He won't be lost anymore, will he?" Shadow didn't reply, but his eyes met Rachel's, not with comfort, but recognition. Some grief doesn't need to be soothed, only shared at the right time, in the right presence. After a while, Logan sat on a large stone, eyes scanning the horizon. "The day I lay in the snow, I thought, if no one comes, at least I'll die in nature." He looked at Shadow. "But I didn't die, because someone chose to stay with me." Jessica smiled faintly, looking back toward the winding path they had climbed. "And now we're here, not to hold Will back, but to let him go, trusting that somewhere out there he'll feel what we once shared." They stayed until the sun fully dipped below the trees, and purple hues began to paint the valley. Rachel leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the top of Shadow's head. "Thank you for helping me finish this journey." Shadow didn't move, just lowered his ears and leaned into her leg. No extra gestures, no barking, no guiding, because sometimes presence is enough. On the way down, no one spoke, only the sound of tires on gravel, wind through the windows, and steady breathing, as if 3 people and a dog had left not just a mountain path behind, but a sorrow that didn't need carrying anymore. That day there was no sun, no rain, just a soft gray light draping the forest behind Shadow Path, like a thick, warm blanket around a day that didn't need a name. No children played, no voices echoed. Everything had quieted, as if making room for a rare kind of stillness. Shadow sat there, on the low stone ledge at the edge of the woods, his gaze locked on the space between the old pine trees. It was as if he was still listening, for something from the other side of the world. No leash, no handler, no more labels like therapy dog, service animal, or rescue unit 41. Just Shadow. Or, as Tessa now called him, Guardian. A soul that knew how to love and how to stay. Jessica stood at a distance, a letter in her hand, folded neatly, handwritten, reserved for only the most important truths. She approached slowly, then sat beside Shadow. He didn't turn, but his ears twitched, listening. She read aloud, slowly, softly enough that the wind could hear, too. Dear Shadow, there are times when humans believe we are the ones leading. We make plans, build schedules, assign roles, but then comes a creature who says nothing, asks nothing, doesn't care about tomorrow, just walks beside us and reminds us who we really are. You are that, a gatekeeper, a healer, not because someone trained you, but because you chose to stay, at the very moment the weakest needed it most. You don't need to be called a tool. You don't need to be owned. You are freedom. And in that freedom you chose love. Thank you for stepping toward Jonah when he first trembled at your touch. Thank you for coming back to Eli, even after he lashed out in anger and hurt. Thank you for lying beside Tessa when she hadn't found her voice yet. And thank you for leading Lila out of the darkness, guided only by an instinct no one could ever teach. We've saved many lives, but you, Shadow, you saved our souls. Jessica paused. Tears didn't fall. They clung to her eyes, like a mist that wouldn't fully lift on a day like this. She placed the letter beside Shadow's paw. He didn't move, but his eyes, still gazing into the forest, seemed to soften, not because he understood, but because he had always known. That day some children came quietly and sat beside him, not to speak, but to simply be near, just as he had once done for them. Jonah brought a drawing, a winding trail through a forest, with the silhouette of a dog walking ahead, and small feet following behind. Tessa said nothing. She placed a tiny stone beside where he lay, a game from her childhood, marking where someone unforgettable once stayed. The town held no farewell, no speeches, because you don't say goodbye to a soul who never really leaves. Shadow remained, on that evening, the next, and the ones after. Sometimes people found him lying in the yard during the rain. Sometimes beside a crying child in the dark. And once, a new nurse whispered that she felt something watching the door that night. No barking, no motion, just a quiet presence that made her feel completely safe. Years passed. Adults grew older. Children grew up. Some returned, others didn't. But Shadow Path remained. And on the wooden sign at the gate, the words were still there. Not a tool, not a pet, just a soul who chose to stay. If someone asked, who was Shadow? The answer wouldn't be in records, files, or training logs. It would live in every gaze, every step, every heart once lost, and gently found again by a dog who never needed words, only love. In a world rushing and loud, sometimes what we need most isn't advice or promises, but someone willing to stay silently and never leave. Shadow never spoke, but he healed dozens of hearts, not for recognition, not for reward, simply because he chose to love without condition. And what about you? In your life, have you ever met a shadow? Even just for a fleeting moment? If this story touched you, like it touched us, please like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue walking together on the journeys where love speaks not with words, but with presence.